Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
Child protection. And Ms. Harder, I see you have quite a group here to talk to us this morning. We're looking forward to the presentation. The floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I'm looking forward to this conversation as well. This is a work group that is highly impacted by this board's ongoing commitment to making sure that kids are safe and well and thriving. You reflect that in all kinds of ways as you make decisions about our strategic plan and our results maps. And so today, this is a piece of work that I know that you are familiar with. We have a really talented group of people here to share some of their experiences with you. I want to tell you, just because there's quite a lot of data in this packet, that it kind of walks through the process that a family would go through in child protection. So the first sets of data you're going to look at is what do we know about reports to child protection? Then what do we know about assessments? Then what do we know about cases and placement? And then the very last few slides are an update on our prevention work. And some of these folks are going to talk about how child protection and those prevention programs kind of intersect. And so with that, I will ask the folks on our facilitator group to introduce themselves. Then I'll ask each person on the panel to introduce yourself and what your role is in the child welfare system. And then we're going to jump in.
Good morning, I'm Kate Zabachik. I'm the Environmental Services Manager.
Good morning, I'm Chris Loggy. I work in Community Services.
Barb Dahl, Social Services Director.
I'm Nikki Hallberg, Prevention Supervisor.
Good morning, I'm Lisa Lindstedt. I am the Guardian Ad Litem Coordinator, so I'm the supervisor for the Guardian Ad Litem program in the 1st District.
Good morning, I'm Julie Swanson. I'm one of the Child Protection Supervisors. I supervise assessment workers and case managers.
Good morning, Trish Meshke. I'm also one of the Child Protection Supervisors, and I supervise assessors and case managers as well.
Morning, I'm Deb Simonson. I'm one of 2 child protection attorneys at the County Attorney's Office.
Good morning, I'm Cheryl Moriarty, and I'm also one of the Child Protection Supervisors. I supervise intake and screening, adoption guardianship, family group decision-making, general child welfare, and our social worker 1 team.
Morning, Sergeant Jamie Pearson. I work for Shakopee Police Department, and I work very closely with child protection.
Thank you.
Good morning again. So I think one of the pieces that really stood out, especially as you read the narrative, is just in regards to the workforce shortages. I think we hear that all over the place, and that is definitely hitting close to home. So I think if you could just start us out by just talking a little bit about what you've done in regards to attraction, retention, and just kind of supporting daily operations in the midst of all the turnover challenges that you've seen.
Sure. We've done, we used to have a group of workers that were considered blended workers. They had a caseload of both assessments and case management. And we determined in the last year that we were going to try to work on workers focusing on one area of expertise. And so last November, we did a shift and have just workers doing only assessments and then workers doing only case management. So I think that's been a little bit helpful in reducing the stress in the workforce. We obviously have more work to do in regards to continuing to work on retention. Trying to think about other things that we've done in the last
I guess I could add that in terms of like the recruitment and hiring, we really actually revamped our whole application process and looked at how we worded some things, how we rated the questions in terms of our candidate pool, and really kind of seeking some diversity in the workforce. And we have seen some success with that. We've refocused some of our interview questions real recently. Also, even just trying to take a look at how are we looking at like who might come here and stay? Pretty challenging. I've tried to do some research on that. There's not a ton within the interview process, but like trying to look at some of our reference questions and such to just look at who we're hiring and hoping that they'll make Scott County more their home.
I wonder if, just as a follow-up to that, if we could look at the other side of it, and not to minimize the turnover piece, I don't want to do that, but for the people who stay, like what keeps people doing the work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think if the workers who have been here a long time were here answering that question, they would speak to the flexibility. People are appreciating the hybrid, although we have moved to people being in the office more than not, and just coming together as a group. They really lean on each other. They're very closely connected, strong teams in terms of people to lean on for support of the stressors. But it's that flexibility, I think, is a big piece of it for them. How they're able to have work-life balance. They're supported to take some time off and supported in supervision, I think, within the hard cases. I don't know if there's more you would want to say or...
Yeah, I was just going to speak to, speak to the same things that Julie said as far as the units really support each other. They have their text streams that they have when they've got difficult cases. They can bounce things off each other. They can receive support throughout the day and into the evenings when they're out on cases. You know, even if a worker's out on a case till 8 o'clock, they can, know that they can get support from their coworkers even at that time of the night. So I think it's super important to have those relationships in this hard work.
Thank you.
With the restructure that you did last fall, have you had the opportunity to see kind of the pros and the cons of doing that? And would you continue to evolve that structure at all?
Good question. I mean, I think I've heard from workers that it's been helpful to not have two different areas of focus that kind of compete with each other all the time. From workers' standpoint, they have said it's been helpful to be able to just work on one area of the work. And it probably has helped with connections amongst the teams as well, because we've got that, really strong workers that are doing just assessments that support each other, and the same for the case managers. And before, we had that group of blended workers that I think felt like they had the brunt of the work because they were trying to do two different things at once. So I think I've heard that it's been helpful.
Yeah, one of the things we lost was one worker for one family, right? Like they would do the assessment and they would do the case management all the way to closure. But one of the things we kept was, for the most part, we have one supervisor for the family. So the families are still experiencing a different worker, but we have that supervisor like oversight on the case. And I think that that's been really helpful in terms of consistency as we're looking at like the strengths within the family and also the worries and concerns and holding that through.
I have a couple follow-up questions to both things that you've been talking about. First of all, on the turnover issue, is this something that's unique to Scott County, or is it happening in all of the counties? And as people are leaving, are they going to another county, or are they leaving the industry, or what's happening with those? And then my second question was part of the restructuring. It mentioned that you eliminated the birth to 5 workers. So I was wondering who's doing that work now?
Yeah, well, so Trish and I lead the ongoing case management, like Metro Supervisors meeting. And what we hear from all the other counties, like we all say the same thing about this. Everybody's experiencing the same sort of turnover and continual like posting and interviewing and hiring. I'm not sure if there's more you'd want to say about that or share what you experienced from your...
Yes, the Metro Supervisors for intake and screening are also saying the same. They're running into the same issue as far as staff leaving and leaving child protection. and either going to another county or to just out of social services altogether. So hiring and retention is a common theme throughout the metro counties as well.
Yeah, I can't think of any in the last few years that have left Scott County Child Protection in our area to go to another county to work as a child protection worker. They are mostly leaving the field of child protection in general and going into like mental health services, therapy, school-based social work, medical-based social work, things like that. And I think we can presume that is because of the hard work that child protection is, and they're burned out, and the younger workforce is not as maybe focused on staying somewhere in general for a long period of time. That's kind of what we've heard from ER as well, that a lot of the younger workforce is wanting better and different and wants to move around a lot. So big job to work on that retention for this area of work.
So I was curious when I look at page number 10. So and on top of turnover, are you also experiencing an increase in caseloads? Is that when it says screen reports in 2012 it was 400, and then up to 800 in 2018. So are you experiencing turnover and increase in work?
Well, I think the increase that we saw, I think it was 2015 with the governor's task force, we saw an increase in number of reports that were coming into the agency, child protection reports that we were screening. And we saw a peak from that 2015, I think it peaked around 2018, and we've seen a slight decline. I believe some of the decline that we've seen in 2020, 21 is probably due to COVID. Kids were not in the classroom or in the schools, and so they weren't having that direct contact other than screen contact with many mandated reporters. And so there was a decrease in some of those reports. And we also, the chart shows a decrease as well. Perhaps a contributing factor may be that through the county and Shakopee-Mdewakanton Sioux community, we had interdepartmental agreement with the tribal community, so some decrease in number of reports there as well. So the peak, and now we're starting to see decline. It's starting to level out at this point in time as far as number of reports that we are receiving. So it's just really hard to determine what has really influenced that. My concern is the COVID and not having the direct contact with mandated reporters.
Thank you. That was actually going to be my next question, was on page 8, that slide, it showed that the rate had come down in 2020, and I kind of made an assumption that as there was more stress on families due to the pandemic, that number was going to skyrocket up. So I was wondering what was causing the slight.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I really, again, I think it had something to do with COVID and agreement, and it's just we're not being seen. The majority of our child protection reports are coming into the agency via mandated reporters.
So this could maybe be a false that the number is actually much higher. The stress is happening and impacting kids, but it's not seen yet.
I would have a similar question, I guess, with page 9, just when looking at it by race and looking at the disparities. And it looks like we're seeing a decrease, or at least the gap in between those served and those served have come down. And what would you attribute that to?
From an intake perspective, intake and screening, there's still a lot of work to be done in this area around disparities. But the county, we're looking at how can we, in our mandated reporter training that we provide, how can we address or have conversations around disparities? Really encouraging our reporters to to be aware of their own biases? And then also, how can they perhaps intervene and offer services to a family before it gets to the point where it's a child protection matter? If you have worries or concerns, to address that with the family upfront, and offer the resources, whether it's the Family Resource Center or if it's through the CAP agency or some type of community-based program to really try and connect and get them the resources, the services they need before it becomes a child protection matter, to do that upfront brokering for the families.
I'd like to ask a couple questions about assessments and investigations. So if you look at page 11, so my first question to Sergeant Pearson, can you talk about the kinds of, I'm assuming that you are not going out on every child protection case. Can you talk about the kinds of cases that you're going out on, and like what are you seeing today that is maybe different than pre-COVID?
Sure. So, you know, just like the intake process, well, I'm part of that as much as I can be. I try to log on and participate in the screenings and the intake meetings in the mornings.
Oh, nice.
So anything in Shakopee, you know, then I have right away, I know it's coming, I'll know who's assigned to it, and we can coordinate later whether I'm gonna go out or whether one of my detectives is gonna go out with the worker for an investigation. I will say, you know, there's cases that we go out on with the workers that aren't necessarily a criminal matter, but the worker would feel more comfortable having law enforcement present, so we go with them. It's kind of the nice working relationship that we have with this agency.
Okay.
As far as what kinds of things we go out on, you know, I've been in my role for 3 years. I was a detective for 3 years. Years ago, kind of seems to always be the same or similar types of things, whether it's, you know, allegations of sexual abuse, mom or dad or both are using drugs, supervision issues, which aren't always criminal. So those are the three I think that really stand out to me.
Great.
Physical abuse seems very consistent throughout.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And then my other question on page 11 is, if you look at the total number of assessments that are conducted against the number of cases that get opened, right? A small number of cases are, I mean, it doesn't feel small if you're the social worker, but a relatively small percentage of cases are getting open to case management. And can you talk about what that means for you? And does that mean that we're doing that 500 plus of our assessments are for people that don't need services, or what does that data tell you? Is that a clear question?
It is.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I guess one thing that I want to say to begin with is that in Scott County, I think we do a really good job of doing really thorough assessments up front. We are not, like, the workers are not a group that goes out just one time and is done unless that's what's really appropriate for the family. We look for every opportunity to use our 45 days to be building up safety within that family and assessing whether or not the family is going to be able to continue that safety response without the need for ongoing child protection services. And we would even consider erring on the side of like monitoring for 60 days versus like opening case management and starting a new relationship. And now that like 2 extra weeks that we needed turns into a month of building rapport and 2 or 3 months worth of services when it could have been a shorter term. So I guess I just want to point that piece out as well. I think I'd like to believe that we are always taking a look at this decision based on like the safety need for the family. And also when I look at this number, it has me pause to wonder, like, what are the times when it's been a more questionable decision, and if I don't have a worker to give that case to because of all of the reflect on, am I, even though in the moment I know I'm asking myself, like, that doesn't matter, what does this family need, but like, am I still impacted by that is a question that comes to my mind when I look at that number.
Thanks, Julie. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add other than our practice of signs of safety within those assessments really brings forward the ability for families to develop safety networks within those 45 days so that we can exit and they can continue to keep their children safe within their family unit and their supports. So, I mean, I think that's a huge thing that we do here in Scott County to try to reduce, I guess, the need for case management and, like Julie spoke to, then the need to change to a different worker and develop a relationship and do more work that the family might not need.
Thanks.
I have a question on page 17 about the foster care placement moves. Just curious if you could talk about moves. Who would initiate the move, or what would be the reason for a move?
Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons for moves, and I guess a lot of times it's looked at like it's placement instability and that's a bad thing. And not all of the moves are a bad thing. Like, many of the moves are planned. Maybe initially we didn't identify a relative and children were in a traditional Scott County foster care home, and then we identified a relative and we moved them. Or maybe the children were with a relative and we are not going to be successful with reunification, and now we've identified a different relative who's willing to be that permanency option for that child over the long haul. And so there can be those kinds of moves that happen too that are really planful by the agency and with the family. There are other times when it really is about, I think something Trish was saying was relatives think they can do it. And then despite our best efforts to support them in that, they really realize that they can't, and we have to, hopefully find a different relative home for those children.
And there are times when we try it with a relative and that relative says they can't do it. They can't do it. And then we may have to go to a traditional home because there's no other relatives available. But we work really hard to keep that relative involved, doing like informal respite care or visits or other things to help support that continued connection, even if the relative can't do the main day-to-day care.
Ask a family resource question. A lot of the data that we have in here looks a little bit more at like numbers and demographics, but you're talking about formalizing the FRC program evaluations. Can you talk a little bit more about like what that looks like and what data you'd like to capture moving forward?
Thank you. I think we're doing quite a bit in the evaluation process. We're working with a team from the University of Minnesota to look at some evaluation. We're also working with our own GIS system to look at what we can gather. And then we're also looking at an evaluation form out of Colorado, which is the FRC force. And we're trying to really gather, like, what are people coming to family resource centers for? What are they looking for? And are they getting what they need at those family resource centers? And in addition to that, we're looking at a family development program, which would be some of the families that are returning to the family resource center consistently to work with those families about increasing their own family's well-being, to hopefully catch people that are in like moments of stress and working through those areas to prevent them from getting to child protection.
So you're looking at potentially then a different system to capture the data that you would need to get at all those elements?
Correct, yes. We're looking at a system that any individual that's working with families can enter some of that data and families' data in case planning into the system, and then look at how those case plans are evaluated with the families.
I have a follow-up question on that. But how do people become aware of the Family Resource Center? Is this by referral only, or is it that you try to make it open to the public so anyone can go and take advantage of the service?
Family resource centers are open to the public. Family resource centers are open to the public, and really it's just about getting that information out to schools, to families. We are seeing that word of mouth is probably the best way for family resource centers to be known to families. So a family will come in and say, you know, I heard from my friend, or I heard from my neighbor, or I heard from someone that was here. But then we're also looking at advertising with, and marketing that information to schools and to families, and working directly with case managers in the social service system and probation, in those areas to get the information out to families.
So I was going to save this question for later, but can I just ask you, so we have put a lot of investment into prevention services, right? Over the last couple of years, that is an area we have invested in. We also have a need to continue to support and operate high quality child protection services. And can you talk about how, like, on your teams, like, how do you think through that? Or I don't know, maybe Suzanne, you want to speak to that, but just how do you think about that balance of how do we maintain the mandated service piece that is really important for us to do well and invest in what we think will be ultimately a stronger outcome for our kids in our community?
Yeah, I think it's critical, Chris, as you talk about. I think Leslie has probably heard me say, in order to do prevention well, we have to do and support the back end of the system, and then so the child protection has to be supported well. I think that comes through adequately resourcing staffing. So as we think about the staff turnover, certainly we have had an overcomp position to help manage that so that we can continue to do strong practice, preserve the signs of safety work with families, because we know we get the outcomes that we are looking for kids and families. I think it comes through good supervision. And so how do we continue to provide this support at the supervisor level? But then as we talk about prevention, how do the two sort of intersect? And so supervisors have done some work even around onboarding. How are we connecting new workers to learn about and understand the role of prevention to help support their work in child protection? How can prevention help either lift the load for workers and or help exit families from protection into more community-based services?
Do you mind if you asked a question about the B25, and I just realized we didn't actually respond to that. And so I just wanted to say that like, we're still serving those families. And a lot of times it's with a lot of the same workers who had like that area of expertise, but it is now like spread out through all of our child protection case managers. Yeah.
Can we talk about court? So on page 21 is some data on the number of child protection cases and permanency petitions that are open to juvenile court. And so two questions really. One is I'm wondering about the impact of virtual court and how that has, what impact do you see on families going through the juvenile court process as a result of the remote court piece? So I'll ask that and then I'll come back to my second question.
Well, I think that the virtual court had a good outcome in the sense that more parents were able to participate, more parents came to court and were part of the process. When they have to come in person, it's harder to get there, and I think we saw an increase in parents coming to court, which I think helped the process.
Yes. Any downsides to that virtual court process?
I think the downside to it sort of broke down relationships because we weren't all together collaborating like we should be. And so we didn't get as much time to talk with the other parties involved.
Okay.
I guess I would add that we heard at times that parents were reflecting that judges were making really big decisions in their lives and they had never met the judge. You know, like you don't think of looking at somebody through a screen as really meeting them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was hard for parents at times.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask about was just that there's some comments in the narrative about just the level of the adversarial nature of courts and adversarial process, but just that has been a particularly difficult factor and a piece that you think may be impacting some of your staff turnover. And I don't want to dwell on that, but I'm just wondering if you have just some observations you could provide about, like, is that attributable to a virtual court arrangement, or is that just something different in our system?
I think the adversarial nature may have increased during COVID. I think we would all agree with that. I think it was there before COVID, but it might not have been happening as often. During COVID, like Deb mentioned, all those kind of like connection times before court when you would be working with the parent attorneys, guardian ad litem, child attorney, where you'd just be connecting with everyone and kind of talking through, this is what we're going to talk about in court today, kind of get to a consensus. That is really hard to do in the virtual world. Even if you do breakout rooms, it's just not the same. And especially for hearings that were like settlement conferences and things, when you really are going back and forth and, you know, trying to come up with things to kind of please everyone a little bit, really, really hard to do in the virtual world. So I think we are happy that court is back in person for the most part. I think one other negative of the virtual court hearings during COVID was, although parents were on the call or the Zoom hearing, they weren't always just doing that. Sometimes they were in the car, sometimes they were walking down the street in Minneapolis, sometimes they were in bed. Like, I mean, so yes, they logged on, but I don't know that they really got what they needed to out of those hearings.
Okay.
So that was.
And I would just add, before COVID, the one of our big settlement cases, we would reserve a room and we'd all come together and sit around in a circle and have long discussions about, I think, settling it, and those were so helpful. We didn't get to do that, during COVID.
It's easier to be nicer to people when you are in the same room and to work cooperatively than if you're either on a Zoom call or if you're just emailing. Emailing, we've seen, can be very, very rude, deliberately rude to the agency, even when the agency did nothing wrong. So there's just been a lot of difficult nature within the court aspect of these cases. And it's hopefully, like I said, hopefully now that we're more in person, that will reduce. But that was a huge factor for worker burnout, satisfaction. Yeah, just getting through day-to-day business was difficult.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to workforce again. Was in a meeting a couple weeks ago with the Department of Human Services Commissioner Harpstead, and she asked a question on, like, systemically, if we could look to support a few positions, or if they were to work with the Department of Employment and Economic Development, what would that look like? How systemically can DHS support some of our workforce shortages and challenges? And so maybe it's from like a training side, a certification side, or is it at like a system improvement side when we see like the amount of paperwork that's there? And probably I'm leading your answer. So. But what ideas would you have from like a systemic, how can we help make this better?
Well, one idea would be to maybe have a whole different computer system than SSIS. It is a massive system that is, there has to be some way to make it easier on workers, but it's the amount of clicks that you have to do to get to a certain spot to enter information is unbelievable. I mean, just to look up information, you have to click, click, click into different screens and try to get in there, and it's just, and SSIS has been difficult to get working properly in the last year, or maybe less than that. But there are times when workers spend, a half an hour trying to get into SSIS to do their work, and by that time they might need to leave and go on a home visit. So SSIS is a big factor. I think also the out-of-home placement plans, they are, in general, 15 pages in length for one child. So if you have a family where you've placed, 3 to 4 children, each parent gets an out-of-home plan on each child and the other parent, and there might be more than one father involved because, each child gets a plan and each parent gets a plan for that child. So the amount of paperwork is extraordinary and it's a lot of time, which would be better served, obviously, working directly with the parents and the children.
Yeah, I was gonna add, like, if those case plans could get modified, shortened, they're a huge issue at the Court of Appeals right now, and those are always contested issues, so those need to be revamped.
Well, and they're hard for us to understand all the things that go into them. So if you have a parent that might, English might be their second language, all of that makes it more difficult. And some of the things in those case plans are not really necessary for the parent to know about. They're just things that have to be in there for DHS or for financial reasons. I guess I don't even know all the reasons. But that's a difficult process. We also, because we have parents that speak other languages, we've been running into the need to translate those documents, and we just submitted one, and it was over $3,000 to translate one out-of-home placement plan.
And I just want to add to that, so that's large, right? It's several $1,000s to do this case plan. And really, in terms of the information that the family wants to know, that worker can probably put it on a page or a page and a half for a few $100s in a way that the family would completely understand. So it's just kind of ironic.
It is.
Just a quick question. So is this like a state database that you are required to use?
Yes.
Okay. So the county can implement a different type of system. This is when okay, thank you.
Can we turn to page 15 for a minute? So this is the number of children in out-of-home placement. This is, we talk about this all the time, this data, partly because we know that placements can be difficult for children and families, and partly because it's a big budget driver. Out-of-home placement is a big budget driver. And so hearing the challenges that you have had with staff and virtual court and just the stress of having your teams work in person during a pandemic and just all those things, your data suggests that you're continuing to keep kids at home and out of placement. And I'm wondering, what are the things that you think are contributing to your ability to be successful in that area in the midst of the challenge?
Sure. I can speak to, I think I mentioned their signs of safety practice and really working with families on their own solutions to solve the problem that's going on in their family. So I think we've kind of come up with our own acronym called Safety Network Action Plans, and we call them SNAP. But it's a way that we can work with families' networks to either come move into the family's home, to kind of be the supervisor of the family to make sure safety is achieved, or a parent might move out of the home and that reduces the need to do a placement, or we might have networks coming in and just doing safety check-ins, and that also can prevent placements. But those SNAP plans is basically where it's not a formal placement, but we use the family's informal supports to try to keep safety and not need out-of-home placement. So that's a big factor, I think.
So informal supports, you're talking about calling grandmas and grandpas and neighbors and all those kinds of things.
Yep. Well, so for example, it might look exactly like a placement in that the children could be staying with that relative. It's just not when Tricia's saying it's not a formal or technically not a placement, it's not, the agency doesn't have custody, right? And so therefore it isn't entered into SSIS as a placement. But if you were to, it'd be interesting to add up the number of children that are under a safety network action plan that actually has them residing separate from their parents. There's probably a number of children. So it's not, a safety network action plan can be like children are living together with their parents, you know, under the same roof, but it can also be where children are living separate from their parents, much like a placement, without the agency having custody, just to clarify.
And I think too, the county, we've used family group decision-making to help in placement prevention now as well. Time.
I do. If we could just take a step back to page 21, just a general question. What is a permanency petition? So how does a CHIPS elevate to a permanency petition, or are these two parallel tracks?
No, so you start off with a child protection petition, and then if we can't, we have timelines that we have to work towards to reunify, and if we can't reunify within those timelines, then we will file a permanency petition to permanently place those kids with hopefully a relative by either a transfer of legal and physical custody to that relative or by terminating the parent's parental rights. But it's the same, it's a new court file, but same family.
I just had one other question about the Families First legislation, and if somebody could speak to what kind of changes, like what should we all be paying attention to with regard to that federal legislative change?
Yeah, I think the Family First work is a work in progress in terms of the state of Minnesota implementing. So one step in that progress is the state has submitted the first prevention plan to the federal government for approval. So that will hopefully be coming, but ultimately it is looking at how are we using evidence-based services to prevent kids from entering placement. So families have to be connected to be determined a candidate. So generally going to be involved in child protection, perhaps children's mental health, and then we could use approved services for placement prevention. And if we use the approved services, you could claim 50% reimbursement. Right now, there's two identified placement prevention services, which is, oh my gosh, Parents as Teachers and motivational interviewing. I will say motivational interviewing is not a service, and so it is, I think from a county perspective, really difficult to understand how that would be. We can't refer for motivational interviewing, and so how we would actually be able to use that as a service is in question.
So at what point would the county start to, so we will no longer be able to recoup federal funds for out-of-home placement, but we will be able to recoup funds for prevention services? And is there a point where we start to experience financial penalty?
Well, I think we're already experiencing that. We've already lost, as of October 1st of 21, we've lost 4E reimbursement, federal 4E reimbursement for kids who go into congregate care. So shelter facilities, placements where multiple kids reside, not in a family. So that has already been lost. And we've not yet established a system where we can draw down 4E reimbursement on prevention services. And the piece to remember with that is we still have to pay out on the prevention service, which is something that, right, we typically are billing insurance for most of those. And so 4E is the payer of last resort. So the question is really how much reimbursement or revenue will we generate from prevention? I think that's pretty unclear. And we're probably still 6 to 12 months away from having the system be built to support reimbursement.
All right, any last questions from the facilitators? All right, then, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Harder. Appreciate it. Commissioner Brecky, you want to go first?
Thank you. Sure, I will.
You didn't see me look around the rest of the room first.
Thank you, everyone. I know it's just really hard work. And just for the benefit of anyone watching or listening, when we talk about turnover, I just want to point out to the packet in 2021, 7 of 16 child protection staff resigned. 2022 already, 6 resignations.
Wow.
So we spent a lot of time talking about turnover, but if folks didn't have this in front of them, I think they're not even understanding how serious it was. So thank you to all of you who are still here. Thank you to the people who left. I know they did hard work too. Let me start with a positive. I agree, Cheryl. I agree with you about we're probably still seeing some effects of COVID, but I think I look at those weekly reports and monthly reports so closely. I think 2022 is still looking good. So that maybe it's not all because of COVID. I think work that everybody's doing is hopefully influencing that. And I just hope and pray and continue to think we're really on the right track. I know you do all every day more than me too. In my reports later, I'll talk about the AMC district meeting yesterday, and the second highest priority at that district meeting voted on for AMC to work on is human services systems modernization. Not a new thing that we're working on, but we're still continuing it. We hear it all the time, and that's what we can do. We can't do the hard stuff you do. We can just do that kind of thing. But I've heard now in our budget meetings and again today about the plan, the out-of-home placement plan, and it seems like that's a recent change about how long and extreme it is, or is it just, it's always been that way? Okay. That I'm wondering, and probably looking more at Suzanne and Pam, if we don't have that, if that's not in like the AMC platform specifically, I know we have a deadline coming up to get that in there. Maybe commissioners should be better able to speak to that. I think today, all of you and at budget meetings talked about that could probably be done much less, and it could be much useful if it wasn't 15 pages.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Brecky, and Pam, I think you've been working with Perry, right? This is one of your top 4, is the 50% time they're spending on paperwork. So maybe Suzanne could talk to that.
Yeah, so it is the out-of-home placement plan is a concrete example of being too long, too cumbersome for families, for workers. So it is part of the conversations that I'm having with Perry. The data is difficult, so I'll be the first to say to ground the time workers are spending in paperwork is a challenge. It was in the Office of Legislative Auditor also who identified specifically the length of the plan, the cumbersome nature of the plan, and really makes recommendations to DHS that needs to look different.
Good. And I just think calling it out from the general paperwork reduction systems modernizations is important because it is such a concrete example. So thank you. Sergeant Pearson, thank you. Thank you for all you do as part of this work. I think sometimes we forget that. Is the relationship with the other police departments or the sheriff's office, if it's a township, the same, as good? I assume all of our child protection reports aren't from Shakopee. We must have a few from other places too. Anybody can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think our assessment and investigators especially really appreciate all of their law enforcement connections. The relationships are great. I watched the more senior investigators sort of bring in and like grow up the new investigators and understanding the value and the importance of those relationships and how to take time to continue those relationships. And we couldn't do this work without law enforcement, and so that's made known to investigators as they're getting started here. And what Jamie talked about in terms of law enforcement going out with us even when there isn't a crime for them to investigate, that is true. That is very true for Shakopee. It is true for all of the jurisdictions. If we are saying like, look, this report involved a gun, would you be willing to come with us? They're absolutely, sometimes they will be the ones to tell us, we don't want you going alone. We're going to be there with you. So it's highly valuable.
Wonderful, wonderful. I just think with, 3 of the cities and you have 2 of the cities who aren't represented here. It's something we maybe should be talking to our city partners about and just appreciating and making sure everybody understands that connection. So you being here reminded me of that today. And then I know my colleagues will have some questions, but I just have to say, thank you, congratulations, good work. We look at the data on 14, on 15, on page 19. This is all really, really good and important and, not, it saves us money, but saving lives also, literally saving lives and changing lives. So thank you for that work. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Brecky, for your thoughtful questions. Commissioner Beer.
Wow, that is really rough work. And I want to pay a compliment. I don't know if I need to look at my county attorney to see if I can say this. What a group of beautiful souls doing really, really hard work. I mean, golly. So thanks for doing that. And it was interesting. So this, I don't know how to describe this work. It's needed. It's like you do work that most of the world will never see. We'll never know. Go about our business, worry about water levels on lakes, important stuff. And you guys are going about, it's crazy. It's crazy. So thank you for doing that. And it was just, we had trouble with the mics and it popped up on the screen, they're all so soft-spoken. And here's this soft-spoken army in the trenches, literally getting it done. I'm getting goosebumps. So thank you for doing that. I also can't help but wonder, I think on my commissioner report, I have the last roundtable on housing. Did we call it the last roundtable? I think we may have found our next roundtable series. Like how do we make this better? How do we make lives better? How do we make your lives better? How do we not have resignations by having other people come help do the work? Because we need help. That doesn't mean we're displacing you. Just to be super clear, we're not in this day and age. You got to be super clear about that stuff. But how can we find others to come help and empty our foster care or have a legitimate, definite respite place to go to put some of these kids? Like I see on page 15, the numbers are coming down, but golly, that's still a high number of kids that are in out-of-home placement. Like the conditions that have to happen. I know this county that's sort of a last resort, and we want families first. We want stable homes. We want all those things, but to have to go in and remove, thanks for doing that work. We were at AMC, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that. Somebody had talked about, hey, we need to get our legislators in. Everyone wants to do the ride along with the cops, get our picture, put it up on the website. That's cool. It's, it's sexy. It's all those things. Hey, what about sitting, are they green screens or orange screens, or are they actually computers like this SIS, whatever it is? Oh. LMNOP. Anyway, it's old, right? It's old. Like sitting some of these folks down in front of this, which maybe we've tried, but we've got some maybe new blood coming, perhaps, to say this is, when you make a decision in some big white building, and it impacts us and it impacts our residents, you need to know this stuff. Seeing is believing. So I think we need to get, assuming Ben may or may not win, but get someone like Ben in here that's new and really see what you have to deal with to protect society. What else do I want to say? The data entry thing was a big deal. 45 to 50%. I mean, I'd rather have bamboo shoved in my fingernails. It sounds more appealing. That just sounds gross to me. So whatever we can do, that was a topic, and I just hope there's courage in that room and beyond to actually make that happen and not just, hey, it's our big priority. So what? Some of those big priorities have taken 20 years. Let's get serious about moving some of this stuff. I think maybe I will leave it. Let me check my notes. I'll leave it maybe there for now, but I'd really love to see this potentially being an area of our next, how do we make this better? And what is Scott County doing that foster system's empty? Because I know there are groups out there that want to do that. So again, thank you for your hard work. It's honestly, it's mind boggling to me. That you're sitting here with smiles on your faces doing this kind of work. I mean, Good for you guys. That's clearly a calling and nothing short of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Beer. Mr. Ulrich, your light's green. You indicate you wanted to comment.
I keep my light on all the time.
You do.
So, but I guess what I'm, as I look at these and, you know, what is not working section here, I'm wondering what is the strategy to correct some of these and how can we help? What do we need to be doing in each of these? I don't need to call them up at the 45 to 55% time of documenting it. It's very troubling. And I mean, how do we solve some of these things that aren't working? I mean, we have to be aggressive. We have to work together on figuring out how to solve these. So let us know what we can do, what we need to do with our legislators, or where some of these requirements come from. But yeah, want to help.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further comments? Just a couple concluding comments from the chair. One is a question. In the reports I'm looking at, I know we're talking about families. I think we talk about families in the old-fashioned traditional sense. We assume a mom and a dad. But one of the things that concerns me, and it has to do with some of my previous board work with some ministry-type things that dealt with families, is fatherlessness. You may not have the data, you don't have the data here. Would be curious, maybe a future board would be, in the situations you deal in, how many fatherless homes would you think be contributing factors to some of the turmoil that the kids are trying to live with? I know that's a real twitchy subject, and I don't expect an answer today, but know that there are those of us that think about those things. If dads would just stay with their kids and their moms, how much less work you would have to do, how much less strain there would be in society in general if dads were present and dads were actually engaged in what they should be doing at home. So I noticed that we don't talk a lot about that here, but I do hear from one of my friends who spent his entire life in child protection and in legal enforcement of those things. That was one of his, he said, we're not allowed to talk about it, but just know that there are those of us that do think about that and think about the impact that collapse in our culture over the last 50 years has had on the work that you have to do. Which leads me to my last comment. Commissioner Beer touched on it when he said we all love to do groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings and build bridges and argue with people about how high the lake should be. Yeah, in ditches. Did you hear the ditch discussion a little bit ago? But what you do is because people don't behave themselves. Things will come off the rails. Real human beings are having real human problems, and we're not angels. It's why we have to have corrections. It's why we have to have police officers and detectives. And I remember it really rocked me one day when I heard about a detective we had on our staff who, on behalf of the city police officers, police forces, did almost all of the work investigating child pornography. And he did that for 8 years. And I think, how does anybody's soul survive doing that work for 8 years? And he finally said to the sheriff, I need a break. His replacement didn't last 3 months. That's how intense that stuff is. That's the stuff we don't get to see. We just know about, we hear about it from time to time. So that brings me to my comment, my encouraging word for you. You're doing some work that has to be really wrenching on your hearts and your very souls. I'm going to say it as a rhetorical question, but it's actually an encouragement. How do you go to bed and unwind at night? How do you go home and unwind? How do you sleep? Are you doing okay? I would encourage you to find some way to encourage each other, to watch out for your hearts and your souls. And by your turnover rate, I see that some folks must exercise care for their soul by getting out of the business. Thank you for staying in it. And if there's a way we can help you encourage voluntarily to watch out for your own hearts and your own souls, let us know. I got one way that I'm already thinking of. In my entire political career, there's always been a small group of people who've prayed for me every Thursday morning because I'm an elected official. I make big decisions. how much to assess a ditch, how big the interchange is going to be. But there are people behind the scenes like you that do real work that really need some care, spiritual, emotional care. I'm going to pass that on to the people who pray for me. Remember to pray for the staff that actually are in the trenches doing the work that actually impact people in really unfortunate and difficult situations like you have. That's the end of my remarks. Thanks. Thank you, Ms. Harder, for bringing that together. Any other concluding comments? Mr. Brecky, please.
Thank you. Your words were momentous, and I hate to not just end there, but I do have to bring up on behalf of some of these folks that they are talking about dads, and some of the new work being done is in support of fathers through Together We Can and family resource centers. And it's probably not at the point to come here and we're not seeing the results yet, but because you might not be here when they come back, I want you to know they are talking about it and they're doing specific services and reaching out to fathers. So just wanted that to warm your soul.
Thank you for ending on a positive note like that. Appreciate it very much. Ms. Harder, thank you for putting this together and for the presentation today. Yeah.
Thank you. We really appreciate the time and appreciate the chance to talk about the work. So thanks.